It was almost 100 years ago in the aftermath of the Great War, the war that did not end all wars, that William Butler Yeats sounded the warning in his famous poem, The Second Coming. You remember the first stanza. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. 99 years ago, that poem was written in the aftermath of the most horrifying experience those who were alive could have imagined in this 20th century, the First World War. They could not imagine greater horrors even to come. But Yeats was absolutely prophetic. The center is not holding. We who now live in the late modern age are witnesses to the great falling apart that Yeats foresaw. As we meet today, the most basic liberties enshrined in our Constitution are confused, contorted, and sometimes even condemned. The enumerated rights recognized in the First Amendment are now suspect in the eyes of many and injurious in the eyes of others. Religious freedom, freedom of speech, and freedom of the press, along with the other rights recognized and respected within the Bill of Rights, are all threatened, even as other rights are marginalized. Even more distressingly, a new regime of invented rights threatens to replace the rights that are clearly enumerated within the text of the Constitution. How could this happen? Well, I speak first as a Christian theologian. We can now see what so many have long denied, that the experiment in liberty and self-government known as the United States of America is premised upon an affirmation of human dignity and human rights that only makes sense within and can only be sustained by a worldview that is Christian or is at least based upon an inherited Christian conception and an affirmation of the rights enumerated in the Constitution as natural rights. The Declaration of Independence famously stated this affirmation in the most direct of terms. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The founders did not fully understand the affirmation they were making, as is clear from the horrible reality of slavery, but they were most certainly correct in their conception of unalienable rights endowed upon every human being by their Creator. This same spirit gave birth to the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights, without which the Constitution itself would never have been ratified. Religious liberty is the first freedom, the foundational liberty upon which every other enumerated liberty depends. But the center is not holding. Religious liberty becomes fragile in a secular age. Indeed, all liberties become fragile in a secular age. The very idea of human dignity will not long survive in a secular season. For once that dignity is grounded in anything other than the act of a divine creator, human dignity withers to whatever dignity humanity can accord itself. The 20th century should be warning enough of what happens when human dignity is grounded in a merely secular conception of humanity or dignity. But religious liberty is also seen as problematic and out of date by those who see liberty in its most urgent form as liberation from the shackles of religious belief, divine revelation, and revealed morality. We now live on the leeward side of a revolution in sexuality, a revolution in morality that threatens to sacrifice religious liberty as injurious to human freedom, sexual liberty, and transgender liberation, and a host of new imperatives. In this view, religious liberty is just another way of allowing religious citizens to threaten the newly declared liberties of those long oppressed and invisible. Consider the fact that religious liberty is now described as religious privilege. By definition, a privilege is not a right. It can be revoked or redefined as circumstances may dictate. It can be withdrawn or subverted by the courts in the name of liberation and justice. And in our day, privilege is suspect in the first place. It's an embarrassment to be identified and corrected. In 2016, the chairman of the United States Commission on Civil Rights, Martin R. Castro, said in an official report of the commission, I quote, "The phrases religious liberty and religious freedom will stand for nothing except hypocrisy. so long as they remain code words for discrimination, intolerance, racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, Christian supremacy, or any form of intolerance, end quote. Now again, I remind you, that was the chairman of the United States Commission on Civil Rights. The commission's report included the terms religious liberty and religious freedom in scare quotes, as if they are merely terms of art, linguistic constructions without any objective reality. We are now witnessing a great and inevitable collision between religious liberty and newly declared and invented sexual liberties. The advocates of same-sex marriage saw this coming, as did the opponents of this legal and moral revolution. Judges and legal scholars also knew that the collision was coming. Judge Michael McConnell, formerly a judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit and now director of Stanford University's Constitutional Law Center, suggested many years ago that the coming conflict would, in his words, feature a seemingly irreconcilable clash between those who believe that homosexual conduct is immoral and those who believe that it is natural and morally unobjectionable as a manifestation of human sexuality, end quote. Accordingly, he called for a spirit of tolerance and respect, much like what society expects of religious believers and atheists, what he called civil toleration. But the advocates of same-sex marriage were not friendly to the idea of toleration. One prominent gay rights lawyer predicted just this kind of controversy just about a decade ago, when she admitted that violations of conscience would be inevitable as same-sex marriage is legalized. Hy Feldblum, then a professor at the Yale Law School, also admitted that her acknowledgement of a violated conscience might be cold comfort to those whose consciences are violated. She said this, quote, "I'm having a hard time coming up with any case in which religious liberty should win. Sexual liberty," she said, "should win in most cases. There can be a conflict between religious liberty and sexual liberty, but in almost all cases, sexual liberty should win because that's the only way that the dignity of gay people can be affirmed in any realistic manner," end quote. Now, just remember again, these words were spoken a decade ago. We were warned. She said, "I'm having a hard time coming up with any case in which religious liberty should win." We remind ourselves it is the first liberty in the U.S. Constitution. Hy Feldblum was then a professor at Yale. She is now a commissioner of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission of the United States, and she has just been recently renominated. Now things are falling apart as Christian cake bakers, florists, and photographers face coercion or even expulsion from their livelihoods. In the oral arguments for the Obergefell case, Donald Verrilli, who was then Solicitor General of the United States, was asked if the legalization of same-sex marriage would mean that religious colleges and universities would have to offer same-sex marital housing. Verrilli infamously answered, "It will be an issue." It will be an issue. Indeed, it is an inevitable issue. It already is an issue. More recently, just last month, the California Assembly passed legislation under the guise of consumer protection that would outlaw any transaction that might be related to any claim that sexual orientation or gender identity might be changed. The legislation would explicitly ban the sale of books and other materials that would represent Orthodox biblical Christianity, the consensus of the Christian church wherever and whenever it has been found for 2 millennia, until very recently, among a very few who have departed from the Christian faith. Assembly Bill 2943, as it is known, is blatantly unconstitutional, but it passed the California Assembly overwhelmingly, a sign of the times. Europe, especially in the West and the North, has followed a faster trajectory of secularization as compared to the United States. But the velocity of secular change in our own nation is increasing. We feel it, we sense it, we know it. The distance between Europe and the United States, as measured by secularization, is shortening. Keep that ominous reality in mind when you consider that just last week, an advocate general for the European Court of Justice advised that religious employers in Europe would see their right to discriminate on grounds of religious belief curtailed. Once again, a legal authority spoke openly of balancing religious liberty and modern individual liberty, and he found that religious liberty must give way. The Economist, hardly a fringe publication, ran the headline, and I quote, "A court ruling makes it harder for faith-based employers to discriminate," end quote. Now, let's just be clear what we're talking about here. It's a court making it harder for Christian organizations to require those who work for the organization to be Christian. The Economist decided a report was necessary. The report began in these words, quote, "It is a problem that arises in every liberal democracy that upholds religious belief and hence the freedom of religious bodies to manage their own affairs, while also aiming to defend citizens, including job seekers, from unfair discrimination. As part of their entitlement to run their own show, faith groups often claim some exemption from equality laws when they are recruiting people." Okay, that's the introduction. Where's it going to go? The Economist went to these words, and I quote, "To take an extreme case, it would run counter to common sense if a church were judicially obliged to appoint a militant atheist as a priest, even if that candidate was well qualified on paper. But," the Economist then asks, "how generous should these exemptions be?" That's the question, the Economist says. How generous should these exemptions be? Now, note the language of the report. This is supposedly an extreme case, counter to common sense, that a church would be judicially obliged to hire a militant atheist as a priest who would be otherwise well qualified on paper. Now, the very fact that the Economist of London is using this kind of language in his report demonstrates that it expects the readers of The Economist to see these statements as absolutely sensical. This is the way right-minded people would think. The question is how generous we must now be to religious people. How generous we must now be to Christian churches and denominations in allowing them to continue to be Christian. This is now an act of generosity from a secular society. The question is, how generous will the society be? So we're now down to the question of generosity. We're now down to the question how generous a secular society, which is committed to worship at the altar of sexual liberty, will be when deciding whether or to what extent religious liberty is to be respected and recognized. Now, we say there is some comfort in the fact that this is the European Court of Justice. That's Europe. This is the same European Union that even voted down an historical acknowledgement that Christianity had once been an important part of shaping Western civilization. So what else do you expect from the European Court of Justice but the question, how generous must we be to those religious folk in determining how religious they're going to be allowed to be? That's Europe. But remember that just days ago, was just last month, at the end of the month, that the California Assembly overwhelmingly passed that legislation that would make many of my books and the books that you will write and the messages that you will broadcast and the truths that you will teach, and, well, you go down the list, perhaps even the pastor you would call, or the Bible that you would give, illegal under the guise of consumer fraud protection. Why? Because a secular society, in deciding how generous it's going to be and trying to balance religious liberty and these new sexual liberties, says it is an unacceptable generosity. It is an unacceptable balancing to allow these sexual minorities experiencing this newfound, newly declared sexual liberty to be told that there is even a contrary argument. And one of the things we see here is that when a sexual revolution like this happens, it is always followed not by persuasion, but by coercion. And we're feeling that coercion right now. Theo Hobson, I often cite about the reality of a moral revolution, and by the way, he's all for it. He said that for a moral revolution to take place, 3 conditions have to be met. The first is what was condemned must be celebrated. We've certainly witnessed that. The second thing is what was celebrated must be condemned. That was Christianity, whereas it is the sexual behavior that was once condemned that's now celebrated. It is the Christian faith that was once celebrated that must be condemned. But he said that's not enough. In order for a moral revolution to be complete, those who will not celebrate must be condemned. And that's what we see here. It's the cracking down, the coercion amongst those who will not, cannot celebrate. Well, it's not just in Europe, and furthermore, it's not just in California. It's on your local college and university campus. And it could well be in your state legislature, or it could well be in the federal district court right down the street. Our constitutional order roots every successive right in the priority of religious liberty. The religious liberty clauses of the Constitution are more basic than any other amongst the enumerated rights. But as we would expect, when the most basic of all rights is threatened, so eventually are all the others. Furthermore, we find a basic moral and realistic logic of liberty within the First Amendment. We also find an interdependence of liberties. Thus, we would not be surprised that the freedom of speech and freedom of the press are also at risk. Americans are often shocked and even offended by the claims that free speech is often denied. But on many of our most elite college and university campuses, free speech is dismissed as a bourgeois value. The University of California at Berkeley, the very campus where the free speech movement emerged in the 1960s, is now a place where speakers are repeatedly shut down in the name of human liberation. It has now grown hostile to free speech, with many students and faculty arguing that free speech renders the campus unsafe. Free speech, we are told, is not safe. And for far too many, freedom of the press means freedom for the press they like. Now, here we need to admit that that is an impulse that can appear on both the right and the left. But freedom of the press means freedom to print, publish, broadcast, post. Most of us in this room can remember when Birds Alone tweeted. But it means the freedom to tweet. The freedom to communicate is a logical and necessary extension of the freedom of speech. There is no freedom of speech without the freedom of the press. The freedom of the press is just a logical extension of the freedom of speech. It's not just the freedom of speech to think it in our heads. It's not even just the freedom of speech to think it in our hearts or to say it in our homes. It is the freedom of speech to speak it aloud in public and to seek to persuade. Frank Bruni, the columnist for the New York Times, you may remember, said that when it comes to religious folk, we need to keep our views, and the freedom of religion, he limits it to the freedom of worship, something that, by the way, you saw happen in the last administration. President Obama would restrict this, as did the State Department, to freedom of worship. Freedom of worship and religious liberty are not the same thing. Frank Bruni, picking up on that same language, said that religious folk need to understand that freedom of worship means the freedom to hold whatever position you believe and to teach whatever you want to teach in your homes, in your hearts, and in your pews. That means keep it out of the public. Well, we now understand that the freedom of the press means not only the freedom to print, publish, broadcast, post, and communicate as that logical and necessary extension of their freedom of speech, we also now understand that without the freedom of the press, the populace is force-fed and misled, increasingly unable even to recognize the truth. The Declaration of Independence expressed the convictions of this nation in stating boldly that we hold these truths to be self-evident. The language here requires our attention. We hold these truths. These truths, not mere assertions or opinions or beliefs. The Declaration and the worldview that led not only to the Declaration but to the Constitution and the founding of this nation was based upon necessary natural truths. Truths that were true because they were objectively real, and they were objectively real because it was a creator who granted them and who grounds them and who alone can define them. We come to understand that our constitutional order cannot survive without understanding the priority of religious liberty. We come to understand that even as the language of the Declaration of Independence used words like hold and truth, the very words they used are now words of essential contestation in a society that wants to deny the very existence of truth, that in some ways on the college campuses declares itself to be post-truth. These truths, not mere opinions or beliefs, are held, not merely asserted or argued. We hold these truths. To hold implies a stewardship. It's something different than just an assertion. It's not just a recognition. The founders just didn't say, we discovered these truths, or we believe in these truths. Rather, we hold these truths. We hold these truths, therefore, not merely for ourselves and for our time, but for our children and for our children's children, and all those who will become a part of this grand experiment in limited self-government. But we also hold these truths for the world and before the world. Remember that those who expressed those words about self-evident truths in the Declaration of Independence, we're not just speaking of truths for those who would become Americans, but of every single human being, wherever a human being may be found. We hold these truths not only for our posterity, we hold these truths not only for our nation, but for the world. Such a stewardship requires the defense of these truths, the careful definition of these truths, truths that should be, but often are not recognized as self-evident. In some ways, that is the most stunning word in the Declaration of Independence. It's the word self-evident. Because they were declaring that everywhere at all times should have seen this. It's almost like the Apostle Paul in Romans chapter 1. These things have been clearly revealed in the things that are made. There, Paul speaks about the knowledge of God. But God has implanted his character in creation, and that's exactly what the founders are referring to. His character, which is the very grounding of these rights. We come to the end and recognize that this stewardship requires everything we have and everything we are. It's not just protecting our interests. It's not just protecting our voices. It is protecting rights and liberties that the Creator has given his human creatures. And they require defense. But we also have to acknowledge, as we're here together in the name of the First Amendment, that the First Amendment will not save us. Without prior and enduring commitment, this text will be reduced to only historic words on paper. I think we can envision a time when there will still be thousands and thousands of people who will go to the National Archives in order to see that parchment when they no longer have any commitment or understanding of the words. The First Amendment will not save us. As Christians, we give thanks to God alone, who made us in his image, to God alone who gave us the gift of life, to God alone who endowed us with these rights. Only Jesus Christ can save, and Christ saves to the uttermost. That is the great good news. The sacred freedoms that we cherish secure our right to worship God in spirit and in truth, to tell the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and to teach the whole counsel of God. That's what I try to communicate about the importance of religious liberty. Sometimes to young people who just take it for granted or assume that the defense of religious liberty is somehow just political. We face a generation of young people who are very committed to the gospel, and for that I am unspeakably thankful. But they also need to be committed to the free propagation of the gospel. And they need to be committed to the free voicing of the gospel, the preaching and teaching of the gospel, without which sinners will not hear the gospel of Jesus Christ. And as the Apostle Paul makes very clear in Romans chapter 10, if they do not hear, they will not believe. And if they do not believe, they will not be saved. The First Amendment will not save us, but it is up to us in many ways to save the First Amendment. There you go. The sacred freedoms we cherish secure our right to worship God in spirit and in truth. Again, to teach and tell the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And finally, to teach the whole counsel of God. That's one of the things I appreciate about this room when I look around. This isn't just about announcing the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's about the right of Christians to teach the whole counsel of God, to contend for what God has revealed in his word about every dimension of human life, and to contend and to explain and to defend why we have a distinctive biblical voice on the issues faced by this nation, faced by its elected representatives, faced by its leaders, faced by its courts. We hold these truths. These are interesting times. I shudder to think what William Butler Yeats might add to his poem in 1919, written, now in 2018, heard. He said the sinner doesn't hold. He says it cannot hold. We're witnessing what is happening. The dissolution of bonds and commitments, the denial of reality, the forsaking of a past, the denial of the plain meaning of words. We're in a fight that's worth fighting. And we understand that as we contend for the freedom of religion and the freedom of speech and the freedom of press, again, we're doing this not just for ourselves and for our children, not just for our churches, but for the world. And we understand, as was expressed in that statement of the Declaration, we hold these truths. It's important today we came together to remind ourselves that we hold these truths. This is a stewardship. Let's pray that God will give us wisdom to hold these truths in perilous times. God bless you.